Alrighty guys, thanks for joining me. This is your host ID Jester. Appreciate you checking out the video here. Today, as you can see, we're going to be talking about creating a fantasy world by ID Jester. So there's, first of all, a big difference between creating a fantasy world and creating a fantasy map. So just designing your own fantasy map based upon standard fantasy setting with standard everything, then that is one thing. But when we're talking about creating a fantasy world, we're talking about history, we're talking about how everything is in the world, what makes your world different, unique, and interesting from other worlds out there. So, quite a big difference. So, whether you're creating a fantasy world for, say, a movie, or a TV series, or you're going to be writing a fantasy novel or a fantasy series, or you're playing Dungeons and Dragons or any kind of role playing game, we're talking about creating a fantasy world. We're talking about a lot of effort and a lot of work that goes into it. But before you even start thinking about maps and start drawing and trying to design the layout of the geography, I think it's important to think about all these important things we're going to talk about in this episode here. So hopefully, I know one of my good friends out there is going to be starting up his own Dungeons and Dragons group, and he's going to be the dungeon master. So we wanted to create something new and interesting for them. So I've kind of made this video for him and everyone else out there that's been thinking about maybe creating a fantasy world or has an idea about it to implement either into a story of a novel or a movie or whatever. These, no matter what formats you're going to be using this world, these are things you should think about. So let's get to it and check it out. So, number one, what is your theme of your world? What is the general essence of the world? If you were going to describe it in one sentence to someone, is it dark and desperate times, say, kind of like Lord of the Rings type thing, where the whole world is on edge? Possibly it's light and cheerful. Everyone's happy. Everyone's gets along. Everyone does good things. Maybe trying to think of another good setting like that. Maybe like a Robin Hood type setting or something like that. Is your world magical? Is it based upon the magic? You can see here we got a picture of a tower of magic. So is your theme these towers of magic that have created essence inside the world? What is your theme there? Or are you going to stick with something maybe a little bit more traditional? Your usual kingdoms and knights and castles and kings and queens and stuff like that. Is it going to have a theme like horror or maybe a gothic or maybe an epic? And also, when I talk about fantasy, are we talking about early fantasy? Are we talking about middle fantasy? Are we talking about late fantasy? Now, a lot of people are probably thinking, well, what do you mean by early, late, and fantasy? Well, in the beginning, fantasy, fantasy setting is going to be low technology and all magic. And then, kind of in the middle, I would say of the genre, you have some technology and also some magic. And then, like late, we're talking about maybe like a cyberpunk or something where they actually have like guns and weapons like that, cannons. A fantasy setting that's magic and stuff is starting to wane out because technology's caught up to it now. So what is your theme of your fantasy world? Is it is something dark and desperate that the players are going to have to fight against the forces of evil, or are they on the fighting against the endless hordes of monsters, or is it kind of a light setting where they're maybe getting into political intrigue between different kingdoms and such, and they don't have to deal with the darkest forces? So what is your theme? Very, very important aspect when you're creating your world. Number two, and this is, for me, probably the most important thing we'll talk about. And that is what makes your world special out there. There are literally thousands and thousands and thousands of worlds that people have created. If you just go in and type in fantasy worlds into like a Google search engine, you're going to come up with thousands of different results. People got web pages devoted to their fantasy world. And what is going to separate your fantasy world from all the other fantasy worlds out there? If you're just creating a map, that's different than if you're creating a fantasy world. So, what is something unique or different about your world that separates it from other fantasy worlds? What is this kind of goes along with your theme? It's which is probably going to be wrapped around whatever makes your fantasy world special. So that can be anything from like the landscape or terrain. You can see here we have these huge floating worlds that are locked in place by these massive chains. Obviously, that's going to be different than another fantasy world. If your fantasy world has like volcanoes all over the place and earthquakes that destroy things, obviously that's going to be different than a lot of other fantasy worlds. So what is it that's going to bring your fantasy world? And it doesn't necessarily have to be terrain or landscape. It can be something underground, something in the sky. It can talk about the stars, the moons, or anything specific about your world. Does your world have a twin that's up in the sky? Can you teleport between worlds? I mean, that right there, off the top of my head, that's a unique idea that maybe you have two worlds side by side that the characters can teleport in between them. So what is it that's gonna make your world stand out? That's gonna make your world interesting? If we take my fantasy world that I've been working on for better part of 20 to 25 years by now, and I still have got issues and not issues, but more of things I want to finalize and kind of create for it. In my fantasy world, uh, there is the shadow planet of the main world of Neramos, and the shadow planet is there. And so you have this shadow and light going on, where the shadow planet every 30 days will cover the sun and it will darken the planet, and they call it the shadow day. So all kinds of different things like that that go on in my world. So that's going to make it my world different and unique than a lot of the other fantasy worlds out there. So what is it that's going to separate your fantasy world from someone else? What is it? It can be, like I say, landscape. It can be terrain. It can be something underground, overground, stars, moon. If all the stars are aligned in specific shapes, I mean, that's, something that, would make your world different than other worlds. But you definitely want to make your world stand out. You want to have some kind of theme that probably goes along with what makes your world so special to you and to your players, or to anyone that's reading your novel or anyone that's watching your movie. Next, here we go. What is the culture and philosophies? So what is the culture and philosophies of your world? If we talk about, Dungeons and Dragons, for example, we have kind of the European medieval theme, which is what most of the Dungeons and Dragons settings is based upon. But there are, if we just look back on Earth's history, of course, we have the Middle East time during that section. We have the Eastern time during that section, and each of them are separated by many different cultures and their philosophies on everything from life to death, and how they handle invasions, and what their philosophies on magic and magic use and everything like that is. So what's gonna be your world's cultures? Are they all the same? Is all your cultures in your world the same as as one another? Are they basically started in one small region and then kind of expanded out and expanded out and expanded out and expanded out? Then they probably have got very similar cultures, very similar philosophies on things. If you have isolated groups in different places, they probably don't. What's going to be your theme of your culture and philosophy? Is it going to be evil versus good? If us versus them? which is even a better term for evil versus good, because one kingdom might think that they are the good guys when the other kingdoms think they're the bad guys, obviously. What separates your culture? Is it because there's boundaries, mountain ranges that keep one group from another group? Is there huge mountain ranges or oceans that keep them apart? Or is it something as simple as some event that happened where a certain group was caused to leave a certain area of the world for some reason? So, they could be have different cultures and stuff because they're now separated from the main group. So they've got their own ideas, their own philosophies, what their ideas are as they kind of expand out. And also, how did their beliefs be shaped? Is it because of their location? Is it because they were thrown out of the civilized world? Did they grow up, um, the barbarians in the north, or, barbarians in locations? Why are they barbarians? Was it caused because they were isolated from everyone who started getting magic and started delving into their philosophies and their religion and their history and stuff, and the barbarians didn't have contact with anyone? Or is it just because the gods had placed them in a certain location? Or maybe they have arrived newly to your world. Maybe they were on a different world than the gods transported them onto your world. There's many, many thousands of different reasons. I'm just giving you the things to think about when you're creating your culture and your philosophies for your world. Next thing is, how populated is your world? And it might not seem like something that's very obvious, but the United States, and just if we look at the United States, the eastern half of the United States is much more populated than the western side of the states. If we take the United States and compare it to something like, say, I don't know, trying to think of a good example here. Maybe the country of Chile, right? The United States has many more people there. Chile is more isolated, away from one another. I'm just trying to think of a good example, but how populated is your world? Is your world very populated in certain regions, or maybe, there are different areas that are populated and everything else is just wild and wilderness? So how dangerous is it to the outside of where your civilization is? If you can see in our picture here, it looks like you got a nice town here in these awesome mountain ranges and the swamps and stuff. When somebody leaves that town to travel to another town, how dangerous is it? Is it civilized enough that they don't run into many problems? As soon as you leave town, are you under constant threat of being under attack, being captured, being taken hostage, or killed by monsters or whatever? Also, how does this relate to how dangerous the civilized places are? This town here, are they everyone work together because they know the danger isn't within, it's outside the city walls? So everyone inside the town is a civilized person and they all work together to help one another? Or are there corruption? Are there different clans inside your different towns because they're trying to take over the very sparse lands? And of course, you have something like Coruscant, which is like completely just swarmed with people, and travel from one location to another is very simple because of the civilization, because of the technology and stuff. How much traveling is there for trade, for help? If this town become in trouble, how hard is it for them to get help, to get someone to come to their aid, another civilization or another kingdom or another town? Is it easy or is it hard for that to happen? Because this can alter how things happen inside your world, just and how populated it is. If certain regions are very populated, they're going to have different cultures and philosophies than people that are on the outside of the kind of in the low-lying areas, or the areas that aren't as populated, where they have to fend for themselves. Every person is very important because If they lose 20 people to an attack, that's maybe a fifth of their population or whatever. And how is that going to affect them? So, how populated is your world? Is it very populated? Is it very sparse? Is it, and again, how dangerous is it when you're not in the civilized lands? Or maybe your whole world is civilized and there isn't much danger outside. And that can alter how things play and how things happen inside your world as well. Let's go on. What kind of creatures do you have? And we're talking about a fantasy world here. And the best thing about fantasy is it's only up to your imagination as to what happens. That's all there is. There's no rules. You make the rules because you are the creator. So, what kind of creatures do you have? You can see here in our picture here. I'm trying to give you guys different backgrounds so you can start the creative juices to flow through you here and try to figure things, try to get you motivated with just looking at different fantasy worlds and how they, correlate. This one here is a desolate place without much life. You can see these dragons flying through the sky. So what kind of creatures are you going to have? Are you going to have the normal fantasy creatures, the giants and the uh, goblins and the orcs and the dragons and all the common uh, creatures for fantasy, and how do they relate to how things operate in your world? We'll take this example here, these dragons. These dragons look like they own this area of the world. Do they rule and do they dominate over this section of the world? Do your creatures, are there many? Are there few? Obviously, that's going to change how things happen in your world. If you have many, many creatures in your world, then obviously, like we just talked about in the previous slide, that travel between different civilized places is going to be a lot more dangerous because you have many, many dangerous enemies for them to run into. If there are very few enemies, then travel outside of your towns are probably not as hard. How does your civilization deal with them? Are they part of the civilization? Are these dragons that are flying around, are they the rulers of different kingdoms? And each kingdom has their own dragon army, or is this an isolated thing? These are the last two dragons left in the world, and they are held up here in this wizard tower here, protecting it because they have an ancient secret that they don't want to share with anyone. You can see a big difference between these two worlds just by understanding how your civilization deals with the monsters, deals with the creatures of your worlds. Have they altered the world for good or bad? Are these good dragons? Maybe they are helpful dragons. Maybe they're not helpful. Maybe they're evil. Maybe they are what has wiped out humanity basically at this point. They've destroyed all of humanity, and they're now at the point of the humanity's on the brink when you start your novel or you start your adventure or whatever. So understanding your creatures, understanding their role in your world, how many, if they dominate, if they rule, if there's very few of them, how civilization deals with them, and if they've altered the world either good or bad. And to go along with creatures, we got to obviously talk about the races of men. When I'm talking about the races of men, that's what the world of Neramas calls them. We're talking about the normal fantasy races, such as humans, elves, dwarves, halflings, half-elves, hobbits, whatever your setting is going to be. There are, the default. Everyone's heard of elves, everyone's heard of dwarves, but does your fantasy world have them? Do you have all the different races? Do you have just few of, maybe there's only a handful of elves left in your world, and it's dominated mostly by dwarves instead of humans for some reason? How do these races interact and feel towards one another? Are they working together towards a common goal? Are the elves working for themselves? The dwarves are working for themselves, and the halflings are working for themselves? How do all the races of men interact with one another? And again, this can all be based upon some of the previous questions you've asked yourself. If you have a world that is dominated by dragons that are evil, then probably your few races of men are going to try to bond together and try to help one another out. How many are there left? Like I said, maybe there's only just a few elves left in this world. Just, 10 or 12 elves. That's all that's left in humanity. Uh, and obviously, are the races spread out or are they isolated? So is there a region where all the elves live, and there's a region where all the dwarves live, and a region where all the halflings live, and a region where all the humans live and they don't interact much? Or is it you go into a town and you see all kinds of different races of men? You see elves, you see dwarves, you see halflings, you see humans all intermixing and working together. If the elves stay to the forest in the southwest corner and that's their lands, and they don't try to venture out because they're protecting their lands against the invasion of the insert monster X here, we'll say trolls, then it's not going to be where you have elves everywhere in your world, because they're not going to be traveling around your world. So a lot to think about when we're talking about the races of men, and also, like we just looked at, the races, the creatures that roam your world and how that interacts with one another. Very, very important. What is your god pantheon like? Very important, because that's part of a fantasy world. Because, normal fantasy, if you have just a medieval setting, and even in our Earth, we had a medieval setting with one god or several very powerful gods at that time. So what is your god pantheon like? Is there many, many gods, or are there very few, or is there just one god? Um, how important is religion? Is religion important to everyone or not? Is it regional? Like, this god has, kind of is worshipped in this region, and a different god's worshipped in this region, and there's no god worshipped in this region, and then over here in this region, they kind of worship everyone. How does that interact with one another? How does your god pantheon, how many gods you have? Maybe like I said, maybe you only have one god who's worshipped by everyone, or maybe there's three main gods, and on the east side they worship one, on the west side they worship another, and in the center they worship both of those two gods and a different one as well. When we're talking about god pantheon, you obviously have to talk about the opposite. We're talking about demons and devils, because if there's a good, there has to be an evil. So if your god pantheon is many, and you have quite a few different gods, then who opposes them? Who are the demons and devils that delve into the world? Are they as familiar? Are they not as familiar? How much do the gods interact with the world? Do they interact with at all with the people? Do they have any defined um, essence there? Do they directly communicate with people, or is it all based upon faith? The people must have faith in the gods, because the gods will not show themselves. And of course, when we're talking about god pantheons, one of the main things with fantasy realms and the powers of the gods, we're talking about healing. So if you don't have that godly healing, because your realms don't have gods, how do people heal themselves then? Death is going to be, much, battles are going to be much more dangerous. The uh, people are going to die at a younger age because there won't be healing. Diseases and all that issues that you're going to run into. So how does your god pantheon, if you have many, many, many gods, are they separated into divine um, patterns? Like, one god is the god of healing, another god is the god of forest, another god is the god of the oceans. Or, how does all your gods interact with one another? Are they all powerful that they all have control over everything? Are there certain gods that take control of certain aspects of your world? But demons and devils, obviously very important when you're talking about your gods, as well as how healing happens and how powerful the gods give that ability to people. So, God pantheon, very, very important. And in my world of Neremos, it is the most important thing. Speaking of God pantheons, kind of the sister to God pantheons, and just as important is what is magic like in your world. That is going to alter things dramatically based upon that one simple question on your history of your world and how things came to be. Do you have a very high magic system? Magic is very common. People walking down the streets are casting spells and nobody blinks an eye because everybody sees it every single day. Or do you have a very low magic system where if you find some kind of magic artifact, it's like, you know, something that is so rare and uncommon that people will worship you almost as a god because you have this object. So very different aspects there based upon how much magic is used and how frequent it is and how familiar it is with people. What fuels the magic, right? Do people just automatically use magic by studying spells and the spells give them the magic? Do they have the power within them? Do they have to have a special mark from the dragons that are, you know, they use this dragon mark as part of their to fuel the magic? What fuels it? It can be anything based upon, again, your imagination. I've heard of fantasy novels and different series where magic is fueled by different metals, and you drink different metals and how they interact with you might be might alter what you can actually use the magic for. How is civilizations fuse of magic? Does all the people like magic? Maybe there are certain regions that don't like magic. Maybe they think of it as abominations because maybe they're more technically advanced than the other civilizations, and they use technology instead of magic. So, what is the civilizations? What's your world's views? Is it the same everywhere? Is it very different for throughout your world? Is the views different in different regions and how they interact with things? Is Magic, the book I'm currently reading, the fantasy novel I'm reading right now, and I'm not going to spoil it for you because I'm going to be doing a review once I get done on it. It's wonderful, and they bring this up because certain people decide to become users of magic, and if they either pass the test or they fail the test. If they fail the test, then they end up being lower class citizen. Again, I'm not going to try and spoil it because I don't want to. I don't want to do that with the novel. But it's very interesting how the views of magic are in this fantasy realm. Is there a cost or penalty for using magic? And I'm talking about physically. If we look at the Dragonlance series, I believe it was, where if he used magic, I forget his name, it was like Radagast or something. I know it began with an R, Radgius or something similar shit to that. But Dragonlance, he was the magic user that his body become corrupted because he used magic essence, and it was so evil, or not evil, but it was so powerful, his body got corrupted by it. And again, who can use magic? Can everyone use magic? Is it just for a select few? Do you have to be trained in magic? Do you have to spend years and years studying how to use it? Again, this will be based upon whether you got a high magic or a low magic system. But who can use magic? Is it available to everyone or just a strict few people that have magic inside them? Or again, do they need to study the magic symbols and cast spells that way? So magic, God pantheon, two of the most important things we're talking about, and they kind of interact with one another and how the world is going to be shaped What is the history of your world? And this is very important too to think about it. You might not think, oh, well, I'm just going to create a map and I've got some ideas to make it a little different and unique and stuff. But how has the history of your world shaped how things are? How did it become a fantasy world in your eyes? Do you have a long, long thousand years, 20,000 year history, or is it very short history? Has the people just started scribing things and writing things down to keep track of things? Has something happened, 1,000 years ago that nobody wrote down and nobody remembers? So it's been forgotten through the years, and now, all of a sudden it starts happening again. What has happened during your history? What important events has happened? Has there been any world wars? Has there been any races that gone extinct? Has there been any special events that had happened? Did the gods come down and interact with the people during a certain period of time? And that's, again, back to my fantasy world. There was an event that happened that caused the gods to come back to the world for a short period of time to interact with the people. Uh, how was history kept? Is it kept in tombs? Is it passed down through people telling stories? Is it kept by casting spells? Or how is the history of the world being kept? Is it known or unknown? I kind of briefly talked about that earlier. Is there an event that possibly has happened that people forget about because it was never recorded? The only reason I know what happened in Earth 2,000 years ago, or 3,000 years ago, or 400 years ago, or whatever, is because I've read and I've heard about it and people talked about it. If people didn't talk about it and there was nothing ever written down, I wouldn't have any idea what happened, before I was born. So, how is it known? Why is it known? Is it known? Is it not known? And how does your history of your world change things? The arrival of the shadow planet to Neramos has changed every single thing on the world since its arrival. And just to kind of, go back to the year 2016 when we had that solar eclipse and how people in the United States were so freaked out about it. And they were traveling thousands and thousands of miles to go check out this solar eclipse that happened. And I know people at our work office were bringing in these special goggles and everything just so they can view it because it was only going to be the first time it happened in, whatever, 15, 20, 30 years or whatever it was. Now just imagine that there's a world that pops up out of nowhere that is now dominates our night sky. So every time we look up during the day or the night, we see this shadow world of ours hovering above us. You could imagine how that's going to change every single thing that has happened in this world. So long and short history, what has happened, what special events, how is your history being kept? Is it known? Is it unknown? And how has it changed your world? And lastly, but not certainly least, these are kind of just as I was thinking about them, I wrote them down. What is new in your world? What, if anything, is new in your world that might not be in other fantasy worlds? Do you have new races of monsters, new races of men? Is there now called the I'm just trying to think of uh, the Zogbots. Are the Zogbots now a normal race that is it's in your world, but it's not in other people's worlds, and they're half insect, half human, or something? Has your world changed any of the normal races? Elves, are kind of traditional, known to be forest creatures in nature and all that. And dwarves are kind of the opposite. They're kind of the mountains and underground. Do your dwarves live above ground for some reason? Are your elves maybe they are sea elves as opposed to wood elves? So they are dominate. Do they dominate the seas and all water and all that? So has your world changed any of the fantasy tropes on the classes or the different races? Do you have any new classes? Do you have any special because of your magic system where you're the only people that can do magic are the people that can use crystals, all right? So every crystal you crush in your hand, you absorb the magic. So that is now a new class of magic user. It's the crystal user or the crystal magic user or whatever. Is there a new class or profession? If you have a world where you have all of these floating sky planets or floating islands above your lands, maybe there's a new profession where people fly from, you kind of think of them as like paratroopers that come off and they go down to the normal people down and, I'm just trying to think off the top of my head. What because of the way your fantasy world is there new, is there new classes? We've got the traditional fighter and the magic user and the sorcerer and the warlock and all that, but is there something new, a technomancer, because he uses maybe trying to think of a good word, a geomancer, where maybe he uses guns with magic as opposed to spells or something like that. Do you have any new monsters? Maybe a half, is there like a half dragon, half I'm just trying to think. Let's say, let's see if I can come up with a good example. Maybe it's the body of an elephant and the head of a dragon or something. I don't know. I'm just coming off the top of my head. Do you have any new monsters? How do they interact with the world? Are they good? Are they friendly to civilized people? Are they helpful? Do they do something that's provided? Like, for example, in my world, like the golems, like the stone golems and stuff, are used to, help build civilization, help build up the walls and the buildings, and they use all their stone powers for that. Do you have any special locations? We looked at that special locations or special powers to your world. We looked at that first background where we had that magic tower that was kind of out in the middle of something. Do you have something like that? That these towering spears of magic or these towering statues of the gods or anything like that? Or maybe your power is all sucked up by into the ground, almost like lava, but that's magic in your world. And again, I'm using some of the stuff from Neramos as for you. So maybe these magical ores are bubbling at the surface, and now, well, immense magic. People try to the different kingdoms want to have control of that because that's immense power and, they can fuel magic. So wars are fought over these locations. So is something like that going on in your world? How, is there something very powerful that's causing something good or something bad to happen in your world? And then lastly, are there anything that's done differently? And what I mean by this is, how, like I said, is something that's normal just done differently? Like I said, maybe your dwarves, instead of living in the mountains, they live, above ground. Maybe they're mostly farmers or something. Trying to think of some other examples. Maybe everyone in your world can, fly to get around by just standing on different magic portals. They fly, they stand on a magic portal, and it instead of teleporting you, it gives you the ability to, use magic to fly to another location. I'm just again trying to think of things off the top of my head. But how are things done differently that's in your fantasy world that people, when they're either reading your novel or watching your movie or playing Dungeons and Dragons with you, or whatever your situation may be, people have an idea of what normal fantasy is. Fantasy tropes. Elves live in the forest. They're all rangers. They all use a bow or, you know, some kind of a foresty weapon. Dwarves all live underground. They're great at stoneworks and they have all of the mines, right? So that's, I mean, fantasy stuff. If your fantasy world isn't like that for some reason, how is things done in your fantasy world? Another good example is, you know, vampires or something. Maybe vampires are in your world, but instead of you know, sucking blood out of people for energy, maybe they do it to get magical essence. So when you're you know, describing your fantasy world or introducing it to new people or something, you have to explain that. Okay, well, there is you know, vampires in my world, but they don't do things kind of like you would expect. And you know, when they kill someone, they suck the magical essence out of them, which kind of gives them magical powers for a day or whatever the situation may be. Uh, so again, this can be anything. How things are done differently. I'm just going to use Neramos again. Is a different situation where now that the shadow planet's there and everyone realizes that every 30 day because of the cycle of the planet and the cycle of the world and because the cycle of the sun and because the cycle of the moon, they all interact where the shadow planet will actually block out the sun every 30 days. So on that 30th day, people do things differently than they normally do. They don't go outside, they don't leave civilization because bad shadowy things happen in the night during that shadow day. So how are things done differently in your fantasy world? So hopefully we got a good idea of what we're talking about when we're talking about creating a fantasy world. We're not talking about creating a map. Maps I can take a map from any fantasy world and I can put it into my fantasy world, but the main core of what a fantasy world is the things that we've talked about. I can use what I've talked about and put it onto any map, any fantasy map out there. If you want to use just a fantasy map to create your own landscape and stuff, and then you got to figure out how all this other stuff is going to come into play. Are you just going to use regular, straight fantasy tropes? You know, if we just look at the fantasy worlds that are associated with Dungeons and Dragons, of course, you have Greyhawk, which is the default setting. You have Faerun, and Faerun has special changes to some of the races and some of the classes, some of the locations. You know, they've gone through fourth edition Dungeons and Dragons, fifth edition Dungeons and Dragons, where fourth edition has created a massive void in the world of Faerun, and now in fifth edition that has now become like a no man's land. So you know, and then of course we're talking about Eberron, the world of Eberron, which I think they introduced in 3.5 edition. That's a fantasy world that's based upon D&D rules, but that is completely different because they have the Warforged. They have the what do they call them? The Shifters. You know that even though that's just a typical fantasy world, you think, you know, that's just regular typical fantasy world because it's part of Dungeons and Dragons. It's not, because all the rules have been changed because of how the fantasy setting is. So when you're thinking about creating a fantasy world, we're not talking about just creating a fantasy map. We're talking about the essence of the world, the the structure of the world, the theme of the world, how the races interact, how the races are, how civilized it is, how populated it is, how the gods interact with it, whether there's many gods or very few gods, the spells and how magic is done, how is that. You know, how is that inside your fantasy world, and how common is it? How do people react to it, and who can use magic? And then, of course, the races of men, and of course anything that's new or different, and of course the history of your world. So all those important things come into play when you're talking about creating a fantasy world. So anyways, this is ID Jester. Hope to share some of my thoughts and comments with you about creating a fantasy world, and hopefully it's been helpful to get you inspired into thinking big picture about your fantasy world, about what important things you should think about and how they're going to affect everything we talked about in each one of these different slides is going to affect something else in one of the other slides, and how the races are and how the creatures are and how the gods are and how the magic is, and to get a good coherent world you have to think about all these different things, because if someone's playing in your world and they're like, oh my god, there's millions of monsters and leaving civilized lands is going to be very dangerous and stuff, but then you do it all the time and nothing ever happens, and it's going to be like, well, wait a minute, I don't understand what's going on here. I thought leaving the civilized lands is going to be very, very dangerous. Or, maybe the eastern part of the world is all got a different culture where death, uh, death before dishonor, we'll say, where they are very loyal. They're very, they believe in king and country over their own lives, and anyone that would try to take something from them or take something from their emperor or their god, uh, you know, they need to seek revenge against them. So just things like that can just change how everything else interacts in your world with one another. And so hopefully this is just to give you a nice overview of creating a fantasy world. Hopefully it's been able to help. We'll check you out next time. Thanks so much for watching. Take care now.